assessing students for instruction. Now, I know you should be getting this in about 3, 4 other classes, but here is the special ed take for instruction. In this chapter, we're going to talk about a number of things that you should be duplicating other places, but I just needed to bring it into this discussion. Let's just have an overview of what we'll discuss here. First of all, this term just of individualized programming. In essence, that's what special education is supposed to be. It's this individualized, and that's kind of a big buzz. And if you aren't doing this, you're really not doing a service to the student. So it's a continuous process of assessment and teaching. When I was in grad school, we said teach, test, teach, test, teach, test, and to see if you're making progress. The first thing will be the stages of learning, which I'm going to ask you to get involved in putting this together. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I'll spend more time on this on monitoring, like curriculum-based, these performance standards, data systems, monitoring that data, and then a little commentary on that. And then first, after monitoring, then how to determine what to teach. What are some formats for that? And then what can be some of the factors that determining how to teach, like teach expectations, stimulus, and I'll spend some time on that in discussion. And then this is kind of interesting about grading. I'll ask you to get involved with that. Some test modifications. I'm struggling with how to really bring that home on tests, so we'll just really kind of have an in-depth look at it. And then at the end, kind of a record-keeping thing, how to monitor this. Okay, assessment. And this is where you start with instruction, is assessment. Whether you're the third grade teacher or the special education teacher, you need to get a feel for where your class is at. Basic goal, establish, practice to collect data. And if you're not doing data anymore, if you're not making your decisions based on data, you're not as effective as you could be, and the textbook makes a nice case for this that I'll share a little bit later. Collect data to determine the effectiveness of instruction. Okay, this is for instruction, not just other things, but the effectiveness of it. So that appropriate modification. So you need to have some way to quantify, to assign numbers. That's what data is. It's numbers. It's quantifying it is assigning a number, so you can compare numbers. To aid in instructional program, assessment should be divided into 2 areas. First, you need to help teachers select what to teach and how. And this really is what this chapter is about, is those 2 things. So some categories of this is screening, diagnosis, progress monitoring, and evaluating those student outcomes. Let's see. Let me spend a little more time on this a second here. And this here is out of your textbook on page 78. It talks about these purposes and characteristics of the types of assessments, like a screening tool versus a diagnosis tool versus a monitoring tool versus those student outcomes. So those are those purposes here of that. So how about this individualized programming? Refers to an instructional program that enables a student to work on appropriate tasks under the conditions that motivate. Isn't that an interesting word to put in there? And this is often where you come in, is not only to motivate, but to help them figure out what that is. And the teacher matches the learner to the task and the instructional interventions to ensure optimal growth. This is that RTI intervention. And I want to put that in one of our lectures. So what is that? It's have you had this? Have you heard about RTI? Well, what do you know about it? have received substantial attention since the reauthorization of '04. The law states that local education agencies, we call those LEAs, is not required to use discrepancy formulae to identify student with learning disabilities, but may instead a process determine student response to interventions and how they're effective, specifically based, scientifically based methods. So this is where this comes into play, that for a long time our only way to identify kids with learning disabilities was this discrepancy model. Familiar with that, where you compare the IQ to their ability, and if there was 1.5 standard deviations, we would consider them to have a learning disability. Well, now reauthorization says you can use this RTI model. In other words, are they responding to typically effective methods? And you got to have data to prove that you're using those and they're not making progress. Tier 1 is this classroom instruction in the general ed classroom. Tier 2 provided more intensive. Tier 3 students receive intensive intervention, often one-on-one format. And it looks like this. You have that pyramid, and we say this is about 80% of the students here respond to Tier 1, this general instruction. And then you have about 15% here that need more intensive support, ongoing progress. This is from the general. And then this 5% up here is the Tier 3 that often need this one-on-one format. So what are these steps? Assess to identify target skills. And here I want you to list these from the textbook. Let me just bring these out here. Assess to identify a target skill or behavior. This is where we start. Step 1 is to identify what to teach. Student walks in your classroom, a special ed student or whatever. What are we going to teach them? Successful instructions begin with that appropriate learning task. An example, an instructional objective in geography might be as follows. Given an unlabeled map of the world, the student will label the 7 continents with 100% accuracy within 2 minutes. This is what a lot of work samples for your LED partners looks like. I've seen this one done successfully. Now you'd have to analyze scope and sequence to know what grade you would have them label the continents, but nonetheless that would be a typical objective for geography. And once this objective selected, what goes from there, and part of that is that scope and sequence. So that's what this is. This identify for this that you want to list these things. Looks like this. First of all, determine that scope and sequence of content, things that you're going to teach. Here's another illustration of that tier system. Tier 1 here that all the students get in the big setting, and then this is more intense than the regular classroom, but here's the one smaller numbers that's often provided in the special ed classroom. But scope and sequence gives the teacher a clear understanding of the skills the student has not mastered in that. Scope and sequence, you can find this in any curriculum, but it not only tells what's in that curriculum, but to what degree they should be able to do it. So one step, and this is what I want you to fill in your notes now, is like a task analysis. If you've had any study at all of special education, you've heard of task analysis. That you take a task and analyze it so that you can see what smaller steps you'd need to teach that skill. What specific skills? In terms of sequence skills to be included in material, task analysis consists of dividing a learning project into parts to identify the skills needed. The notion by learning is cumulative. Task analysis use precise instructional objectives because they allow teachers subsequent instruction. A well-formulated objective for a task includes a condition. Remember we wrote IEPs? This is the same. It has a condition, a criterion, and the behavior. So like enabling behaviors are those perspectives that perform the specific behavior. Enabling behaviors are determined by working backward from this. Process builds a hierarchy of skills. And then there's the difficulty level. Stresses that teaching easy material prior to teaching this. The following examples illustrates this. Over here. Terminal behavior to read a simple sentence. Here's a simple task analysis. Performs left to right eye movement. Associates sounds or letters with symbols. Blends sounds into words and reads the words. Then temporal levels. Temporal meaning what? Time. Temporal sequence of tasks that have logical or temporal order. For example, teaching the concept of place value should precede instruction in computing problems that require regrouping. A more apparent temporal task analysis consists of putting on a sock before putting on a shoe. Okay? You got to have this skill to do this skill. A development sequence involves a gradual progression through subskills. Like this, in order of counting and then adding and then subtracting, multiplying, division. You know, that's a pretty accepted way. First you count, then you're able to add, then subtract, then multiply, and then divide. The subsequent approach to task analysis that clearly states the behavior, those types of things. So the step task analysis clearly state the behavior, identify the skills, informally assess this, and then teach that order. And then here on page 81 of your text kind of takes you through that. Okay. There's some so let me see if I can bring this to another level. Let's say that you want to teach this addition. Well, one of the things in the task analysis is you want to add 39 plus 45. Okay, a student would have to know the skills. The first thing, you would have to know place value to know how to line them up. That one step would have to be is put them right in order. Here's another skill then. Step 2 would be add them. 5 and 9 is 14. 4, carry the 1. Put the 1 up there. This is the carry, so that's step 3 is carry. Okay, then you multiply this out, and then you need a placeholder here. Step 4. 4 times 9. I better do this in 5 times 3, 15, and bring this down 16. But see the steps. 4 times 9 is 27. Carry the 2. 4 times 4 times 3 is 12. Plus 2 is 14. So you see the task is that there's a number of steps you have to do before you can go on. So here's another assessment thing. These two base words and contractions, the student writes the contractions. That you give them something and see what they can do, and the criterion is down here at the bottom that they should be able to do it 7 on 7 correct. That's the criteria of this assessment before you go on. If they miss even one of those, chances are they haven't have mastered that. So the task analysis, and then decide what behavior to assess. Let's see where I'm at on this. does this involve? First of all, you work from that global level, meaning of all the things that they need to learn, such as spelling or reading, is a global level. And it's usually based on referral information like teacher observation results and standard testing. There's some reason that one's being referred or needs this assessment, needs this instruction. So decide what to assess, and then select an evaluation activity, whether activity is a survey or span of skills, whatever it is that you're going to use. Then administer that device. So list those things here. Then record their performance and determine that long-range instructional objectives. Then determine factors likely to facilitate learning is on how to teach. This example, Tony's teacher may notice that Tony's completes seat work much faster when responses do not require him to write small size letters and numbers. So can he respond differently? That maybe he needs worksheets that have large spaces. And this type of information is obtained through sources and direct observation, meaning you observing. Much information will come from this, what we call direct observation. You observing, or someone observing and recording. Then you plan that instruction. A teacher uses fundamental teaching principles and monitors student progress to determine whether instructional changes are needed. And then the last step is that you begin daily managed instruction. There are really 4 options for this: repeating that same instruction, or modifying that instruction, introducing a new teaching strategy, changing it easier. Remember on the last one other lecture I said there's 3 things that, if a student's not progressing, well, one could be on the IEP that your goal's too high, that they don't have the ability to attain the skill that you're teaching. The second one is your instructional methods. And the third may be motivation. But how do you know this unless you have data? So you provide this, you do this analysis, and then what are those available options? Same instruction, modify your instruction, introduce a new strategy, teaching strategy, or make it an easier task. And once you change those things, then you go back to this teach, test program. Okay. 4 options here, and again, I want you to bring these in here, these 4 options, and those 4 options are back here on this page. Please list these in your notes also. These 4 options right here on page 83. Probably want to stop this now and put those in. Here's the stages of learning, and I know you're familiar with these stages of learning, and here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to bring these in into your notes now, and just one line about each of these 5 stages and an example of each of those. And that comes out of this here on the stages. And it's pretty well done here. The stages of learning: the acquisition, the maintenance, the proficiency, maintenance, generalization stage. And you'll need this knowledge of this, your awareness of this, to understand the ideology of teaching. Then the adaptation stage, and then there's just some commentary on the stages. And one of the things it says in the commentary, there's not enough research to know. If I can just read this to you, documenting successful approaches for developing generalization and problem solving is limited. Most students' studies document effectiveness only short-term effects. However, some research in skill generalization appears promising. For example, IDLE reports 8 projects in which generalization occurred through the use of behavioral tactics. So it's not real strong there, but you have to understand that to know why some students struggle with this. So now we get into this next step, and that is that monitoring. Monitoring the performance for determining what to teach. We're still in what to teach. And again, if I can read this, during instruction, the teacher decides whether the task difficulty level is appropriate. That is, the student should perform the task without prolonged failure or frustration. Without prolonged failure or frustration. Earned, I double highlighted, earned success is a key concept in monitoring task difficulty. The student must view the task as demanding enough to realize some sense of accomplishment is appropriate. So this is a big challenge in our special ed instruction. That the skill is challenging enough that they see it as viable and yet not too challenging that it frustrates them. So database instruction is a major principle on this. Database has roots in applied behavioral analysis. And you know, in the behavior class you're talking about this. Applied behavior analysis, precision teaching, and direct instruction, and criterion referenced instruction. And you'll become familiar with all those terms. So curriculum-based assessment. So this will be our new thing here. CBA, curriculum-based assessment, refers to any approach that uses direct observation and recording of students' performance in the school curriculum as a basis of obtaining information to make instructional decisions. So this is you. Remember what we just said a direct observation is? You've observed it. And you have to record it. Now this thing about recording is it's an ongoing thing. Why I say that is this. My brother worked in juvenile corrections for 10 years, and one of the things he learned from the judge was if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. And so you need some kind of a systematic recording methodology, and we'll discuss some of those here a little bit later, of these observations. So within this model, a curriculum-based measurement. So this CBA is one thing. So a curriculum-based measurement refers to the use of specific procedures where a student and academic skills are assessed from repeated rate samples using stimulus materials taken from their curriculum. So repeated rate samples, and rate is the most common way we compare a skill, is how fast they can do it. Otherwise, you go back to the stages of learning. If they can't do it at a certain rate, for example, multiplication factors, if you can't do it with a certain pace, you really haven't mastered it. For example, this, that if you have this, if you do time minutes, if I can do, you know, you give me a time thing, and I can do 6 multiplication factors in 1 minute, 6 out of 6, I get all 6 correct. Would you say that I know those? This is why we look at rate, because for mastery you have to be able to have a certain rate, and sometimes that's only established by comparing this student to peers. So that is rate samples. The primary use of this is to establish direct or classroom performance standards and identify the students who need instruction, special instruction, and monitor that progress towards those long-range goals. So how do we use this curriculum-based measurement to establish those standards? Well, using the curriculum CBM, curriculum-based measurements, to establish standards that involve four components: material selection, test information, test administration, performance display, interpretation, and decision-making frameworks. So here's some examples of material. Selecting appropriate material from the school curriculum begins the assessment process. Where from? Yes, the school curriculum, whatever they're using. Okay. Appropriate material is at the level a teacher expects the student to master by the end of the school year. It may include the following, like reading a 200-word passage from a 4th grade basal book without poetry, exercises, or excessive dialogue. Dialogue is like quotations and stuff. Why? Because it's hard to get a true sense of their fluency when they're trying to figure out poetry or exercises or dialogue. But start with a 200-word passage, because remember, it's going to be a timed test. Or spelling, all words from a 4th grade spelling curriculum proportionally divided. Or math, 36 from randomly selected commutation problems. These are all assessment possibilities of selecting that material. And the object of these samples of the school curriculum is to represent academics, what they can do. And then this administer that test. Once you've selected it, administer that to the student. And here's some steps that could be: select a passage of gold material, place it in front of them, keep a copy for examiner. You know how to do this from your reading instruction. It just tells you exactly how to do that, how to analyze this. You're going to have them read for a minute, and then you're going to analyze, how fast they were, and note the errors for instructional purposes to see if you can see a pattern in the errors. Then performance display and interpretation. The top and bottom T's represent the 90th percentile. This is in the how you do the box plot. Familiar with the box plot? This is how you plot the whole class. Includes the 50th percentile. We can look at that in a second. Then decision-making framework. Let's see what I have on this here. Making instructional decisions. Establish performance standards. Because it has to be more. You have to know what they can do performance-wise. Remember, you have to have condition, criteria, behavior. To what degree. Okay, and administer to all students in a targeted group. And then go through this here, a decision-making framework, and this is part of this. You administer the test. Place it in front of them. And I said you have this in your other classes, and if you haven't had it, you will. And this, we need this down here if we can do 2 or 3 passages, because we call that baseline. How to do it in baseline. Then direct measurement, focus on relevant classroom behaviors, stuff like that. So this individual decision framework up here, teachers who work with low-performing and special education students, however, the real power of this assessment is applicably in establishing a formative evaluation. You like that word? Formative evaluation? What's formative is you decide how you're going to do it by administering successfully lower or higher materials from one grade level to the other. Rather than placing students into instructional material according to percentage correct, as is done with informal reading inventories, placement validated through research can be made by placing the student in the level in which he or she is most comparable to others. This is how you establish your reading groups. Not by correct, by most like the others in that group. Okay. Individual reference data systems. Oh, here I underline Lindsley. There's a question on the test about that. Who introduced precision teaching? Lindsley. Remember that name. Okay. Many educators have recognized the value of data-based instruction. So that's what that's about. And a lot of systems having data. First, a direct measurement. One of the most important features of database instruction is its emphasis on direct, continuous, and precise measurements of behavior. Precision teaching, like oral reading rate or math computation rate. Measure it and evaluate it and set it to rate. Because again, what difference if I can read all the words in a passage if my rate is so slow? And like I was sharing before about math. So what if I can figure out all 6 multiplication problems in a minute if the norm for that is 60 in a minute? Or 50. Then repeated measurements, be able to do it consistently. Performance is a single measure in one occasion, whereas learning is indicated by a change in performance over time. I continue to measure that to make sure I'm making progress on it. This is the box plot. Are you familiar with that? Box plot is where you plot the scores to see where they fall. Rank the scores from highest to lowest first. In terms of percentage value of a single score, compute each score's value by dividing 1 by the total number of scores. For example, in a ranking of 31 scores, each score equals approximately 3.2%. 1 divided by 31 is 0.032. Then determine the points in ranking that are the 90th percentile, 75, 25, and 10. Think you could do that? Put your students in a box plot. Then determine the 50th percentile. In other words, who's in this group? In the bottom, who's in the top 50 percentile? Okay. That's a box plot. Here's the next page. Box plots of oral reading fluency of a 5th grade class. So here's somebody that administered 2 different ones, passage A, passage B, and compared them. Although daily measurements provide the best data for making teaching decisions, research indicates that twice weekly monitoring of academic performance is as effective as daily monitoring for promoting academic achievements. I'm for daily. And everybody agrees. Just because I think it's the one I've seen daily used, it creates a nice routine for the student. That I'm going to do a 1-minute timing of my skills each day. Direct instruction models favor this. And we talks about permanent products and those types of things. So direct measurement, relevant classroom behaviors like oral reading or math, repeated measurements that a behavior be counted and recorded over a period of time. Teach, test, teach, test. You have to know if you're making things. And we talk about observational recording techniques. Here they are, and here's what I'd like you to do is each of these, is you make note of each of these, what they are, an example of each one. Put this in your notes. And this is on a behavior class also. But 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these give an example of what this is. First tell me what this is, and then one line about example when you would use this. These are temporal, meaning timing. We get into graphing, and I want to go back to the textbook a little bit on the graphing. Graphing is the most common method of representing data. Graphing, that's the best way to analyze it. Graph it. Data must be converted into the form that allows a consistent graphing. So somehow, whatever data you get, convert it to a number that can be graphed. Here's your observation recording techniques that you can use for the notes. I know you've heard of these Also, permanent product recording. Here's the first one. Duration, latency, those are temporal. Anecdotal, and there's some examples here, and again I want you to pull this out of here so you have it. Interval, time sampling, bring those out of here. Basic format of graphing is a line graph. You know, line graphs, 2 x's. Then there's a bar graph. The line graphs look like this, you know, that you can plot it either way. Your 20-minute sessions. There's some other ones over here too, but your long-range goal monitoring comes from these line graphs. Students' baseline includes the first 3 data points. If you're familiar with that in baseline, that you simply start out, and I pop this on here also. You have a line graph, a bar graph, a ratio graph. Reports that graphs serve 3 purposes. They summarize the data, they communicate, provide feedback and reinforcement to the learner and teacher. Summarize so you can interpret what those numbers mean, because you're getting numbers. He gets 30 on his Mad Minute. So what? Unless we have a graph, that number doesn't mean anything. We could have all kinds of numbers here, but unless we have a graph, it's hard to interpret them. And then this communicate intervention effects is the intervention is what were you doing, what method to get the ones that were more successful. This is huge, and your success is how do you know what's working unless you have some way to compare data. And then this feedback and reinforcement to the learner and the teacher, you. But I used to let my students do their graphing, let them put the points on if they were making progress, especially on math facts, on math like that. Data must be converted into form that allows for consistent graphing. This involves reporting 3 types of data. You know this in number correct or percentage, and rate's a big one because, like I said before, it's number correct by time. If we don't work at a certain speed, it's hard to determine, you know, if we're really mastering the material. Number correct, percentage, or rate. But you have to decide which of those would be most important to graph. A direct measurement, the repeated measurement, and then you graph that, determine those long-range goals, and then short-range performance monitoring. And then you analyze that data. So I want you to, again, for each of these, make one line for each of these in your notes, what that means out of the textbook. That's what this is. You may want to stop now and do that. Okay, this I brought out of the textbook, but this is what I think is the most common, where you graph it, and you could do this on an Excel spreadsheet easily. So here is your instructional aim. That's what this line is. You have an aim of where you would like to get them. You'd like them digits correct per minute. The digits are 1-minute timings, and you see here Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. If you're not using these days, and what I used to do is number these by dates in the calendar or days of instruction. But each day there is a data point every time you do this assessment. There's a data point of how many correct they got. Digits correct per minute. So 1-minute timing, and you walk up like this, and you just keep going here. And this easily can be done with a spreadsheet. This is a different kind of a monitoring chart from the standpoint of now these lines here indicate different interventions, and you very dubiously keep notes what those interventions are that you're using. What are those interventions? So here's your baseline. There's 3 points. Correct something's per 2 minutes. Okay. I'll correct responses in a 2-minute time block. And then I say, well, first I'm going to let them sit here, or I'm going to let them use the computer and get this here. And then I'm going to stop the computer, and I'm going to let them use a different computer system to see if I can affect this. And then over here I'm going to stop that, and now I'm going to use Computer 3 program and see what happens to it. And this is my aim, this kind of growth. And here's the school weeks, and I keep going by school weeks. That's what graphing looks like. This is what your work sample will be based on. Want to see this in your work sample when you student teach. And how monitor this performance. Initially, that teacher counts only priority behaviors, then the strategies that will facilitate that, and then they evaluate this recorded data frequently of how they're going and uses probes to curriculum reference testing. This means a tool for teaching rather than a cause. And this is that thing here, these different interventions that you're analyzing it. And again, if you don't have good dubious notes of what you're doing for instruction, and this is the kind of change we make, if we're not progressing like we want, we change instruction, we change the intervention. That's what the different things we do, and it could not only be instruction, it may be where we do it, a regular class, or how it's done. Those are all those what we call inputs are called interventions. Okay. I want to take you back to the textbook. Okay. And there's where I got that graph there. And here is a bar graph, which I think is okay, but it's just a little hard to use. And short range is mastery of monitoring chart, how to know what they're mastering. And when a student masters a short-term goal, a new goal is established. And monitoring continues through the series of short goals. But monitoring and be able to justify, and this, we'll get in this later when we talk about grading, but grades to me doesn't communicate what this graph does. When a grump like me comes in, I'd like to see what, this data from my son. That's how you communicate that. That's how I know and you know if they're progressing. So here's some long range, again, correct responses. That's where this came from. Specifically precision teaching. The teacher performs the following steps. Selects that behavior, develop the task sheet or probe for evaluation, graphs the data 2 to 5 times a week, and sets instructional aims and correspond to that. 2 to 5 times of assessment, doing your 1-minute timings. Design how you're going to teach, what you're going to teach, and analyze that data to make those things. What is a probe sheet? Are you familiar with that term, what a probe sheet is? There's a probe sheet. Is anything you use to probe to see what their skill is. This is just a little multiplication thing. Sums up to 9 and be a 1-minute timing. See what they can do. Then analyze the data. Well, generally 80% is accepted as mastery. Some write it for 90, but generally if you can do it with 80%, the thing is, it's too hard to get that last 20%. So if you get to 80%, they should be able to take on the next skill. And they should be able to do that 80% with some frequency. And it may be better if you express it in rate. That's how you do that. This is a more complicated one that's sideways in my textbook. But if you look over this, take a minute and look over this. Here's another one, correct responses versus incorrect responses. And this is really a good way also, because often they are complementary. Level of behaviors, for example, you want increase correct responses and decrease incorrect responses. Another thing that I see commonly done this is on the same graph you would graph reading fluency and errors. And you'd like to see them both because often they are proportionate. Precision teaching and instructional aim usually is defined in terms of rate of correct and incorrect responses per minute. Precision teaching, and that's a big word. Remember that word. Because if they're not, the rate isn't right, you keep doing the drill and practice. Ideally, an aim should be mastery level of the skill. and this makes it hard. What is the aim? Research does not conclusively determine specific aims of academics. Teachers must use their own judgment for aim. And I think when I was teaching, it was my biggest frustration how to determine what an appropriate goal is on what they should know. And this takes you all through how to figure out what that aim might be. Charted data enable the teacher to determine whether the student is making acceptable progress. That's your job. And if they're not, is the goal too high? Or is it your instructional methods? And this is what we expect you to be as a special ed teacher. We expect you to be kind of a methods guru, that you always have another thing to try. Now granted, a lot of times students may have somewhat of a reduced ability to work with this, but you got to have a bag of tricks. You got to have a number of things that you do. Each time an intervention change is made, a vertical line is drawn on that chart like I showed you before. The most desirable pattern is clear-cut, an increase in the rate of appropriate or correct responses and a decrease in incorrect. Students with learning problems often are identified because they have trouble keeping up with instruction. This is the primary thing. I'm telling you, class, they can do this. They just can't do it as fast. They can't keep up, and as they advance through the grades, this becomes a bigger issue. The rate. They can't keep up. So they fall further and further behind. So changes in that performance over time can be assessed several things. First of all, level performance refers to immediate changes in level performance that occur when an intervention is introduced. And slope is another goal, meaning at what rate. Then the overlap, what are those values that are common across both? An example of a rule is a 3-day rule, get this, in which the teacher makes an instructional modification if the student's progress is unsatisfactory 3 consecutive days, and I would say 3 consecutive assessments. And if you're doing it every day, like I suggest, in 3 days, if they do not make progress on their rate, make some adjustments to what you're doing to teach it. And that's what your job as a teacher is, whether you're the 3rd grade teacher or the special ed teacher, is to modify and change those interventions, those instructional things that you're doing to work on a skill, and continue to assess. Teach, test, teach, test. So what are the guidelines for this monitoring? Well, you usually count this. Here, I can take you back here now. You're going to monitor this progress. You've determined what you're going to use and what you're going to teach. Then you count only the priority behaviors. Then facilitate timings and recordings. Then you evaluate that recorded data. Probes. We just talked about what probes were. And then you look at the system. The teacher can take some group timings. If you've got the whole class, let me bring these down. If you've got the whole class, it's okay to do group things, group timing. A lot of teachers do this. Mad minutes for the whole class, or handwriting samples for the whole class, math sheets for the whole class, reading things, spelling activities. You can do that as a group. Okay, so you can do that. Students can record. Students can record their own also. Stop and start time, that can be done easily in a rubber stamp or clock or the students' worksheets. A kitchen timer, pre-recorded tape, can work together in time, record one another. Student can read into the tape, record the computer, or create an audio file. Tape recorders are old. I would go to the computer and teach them how to do their reading samples there. And the nice thing about that is you can analyze it later. And also, if you're having them with the computer creating audio files, save them, archive them, so you have permanent record of how their reading samples change. Teachers later can document correct or errors of this. This was another thing that we did. Those that you were with me know about this too. You can have a cool timer where you can set this for like 1 minute and start them to do their things, and then they know. You can run this over your projector. Okay, and that has an application for a number of things. We had some online ones, but you can use that for your timers. But you can do time zone, and some students aren't going to like this, but make it more fun by letting them handle the data when they're done. And the other thing they'll quickly realize, especially if you're doing it every day or every other day, that they'll recognize if they're making progress or not. And you'll start to be able to more effectively find interventions that help them. And then they plateau. Then they get to a point, that's all the farther they can make it. Okay, mechanical counters can be used, like single and dual counters, as well as beads, golf score counters, and stuff like that. Golf cart clicker, with your hand. Counting should be done in a fixed period of time each day. Counting for different intervals confuse the data pattern because such factors as endurance, boredom, latency. And that's why that's the factor with the 1 minute thing comes in, because most of them will give you 1 minute of effort. You do chart, no rate plotter is necessary. So you can always compare. That's why whatever you start with, you stick with, so you can compare. Aids, peers, and everybody can learn how to do this. That's the other thing. You can quickly teach, so you don't have to do this each time. That you have a number of others who can do that. Aides, peers, student teachers, and volunteers can all do these 1 minute timings and plot them. Then again, here is a number of things, assessment of how to teach. And before I have you I'm going to have you write one line about each of these in your note too. Let me take you out here to the textbook where it talks about these how to teach. And that's a big jump here. Again, here's more graphs, and these lines are the intervention changes. Well, this is still a commentary on database. Considerable evidence supports the positive association between data-based monitoring and student achievement gains. Okay, this is what I want you to get from here. This will bring it home. They have documentation that it's about a 26% increase in learning if you use data or if you don't. Database programs monitored student progress and evaluated instruction and produced 26% more gains than if you didn't use data. 0.7 standard deviations. That's huge. You owe it to our students to give them at least that much more by simply managing the data. That's for their learning. That does not include how much easier it is to communicate, how much easier it is to make decisions, how much easier it is for them to see. So that's the evidence for data-based monitoring. When teachers establish moderately to highly ambitious goals, students also achieve better. Your expectations, you expect more. And database is time-consuming, is a prominent among users, but they find over time when they analyze that too, it didn't take any more time than the other assessments that you used. Okay. So here's our jump from assessments to assessing how to teach. First we talked about assessing what to teach, and now how to teach. Okay. So what is it? Well, Many educators now recognize environmental factors such as inadequate teaching can be a trigger to low achievement. Both student and environmental factors must be considered. In other words, them and you. What they're doing and what you're doing. The efficiency of instructional process depends on how well a teacher or diagnostician, you ever been called that before? Well, that's what I'm asking you to become in this process, is a diagnostician, somebody that can diagnose, determines the manipulates factors that best facilitate student learning. Because if you can diagnose, you can manipulate. For example, Miss Allen, a classroom teacher, observed that because Ronnie constantly asks classmates whether his responses are correct, he is not using his time wisely during spelling. To improve the situation, Miss Allen made a spelling tape with the week's words listed, spelled correctly, and Ronnie's use of study words. Now, let me say this to you, before you wonder what I'm talking about in spelling recorded, that a lot of this research is done prior to the technology we have now. So back then they used tape recorders and overhead projectors and those types of things because we didn't have the integration of technology that we have today. So that's why some of this is a little bit trite that way. If Ronnie subsequently learns an average of 1 word more a day without increasing the time spent on spelling, the instructional program has become more efficient. So, because throughout the year, if it's 1 word per day, think how many more words per year just by that one thing. And that's how you justify the time involved. So here's these formats for determining how to teach. First of all, systematic observation. And this is what you'll want to pull out of here. What precedes that behavior, the behavior, and what follows it. We call it the ABA. Antecedent, behavior, consequences. Please write that down in your notes. ABA, antecedent, behavior, consequence. The ABC. Okay. Systematic observation is simple to use and can be done in a variety of settings. Like you select that behavior you're going to observe. Make sure it's observable. Select a method to record that behavior and describe that condition, which that should be. And again, this is straight out of your behavior class. Selecting a target behavior and recording the frequency of that behavior is important here. Then you do this formal assessment, and what they found, what this is, it says they don't have good formal assessments for determining how to teach. This is again you. You find a systematic way to observe it, and then you put that together, the ABC model. Okay. Then criterion tests is primarily assess what to teach. However, because they can be used to evaluate the effects of instruction, they can all be used to determine how to teach. For example, a teacher may divide a list of spelling words into 2 lists to determine whether a multisensory spelling activity or flashcard drill is more effective. By administering a criterion test for each set, the teacher can compare the student's performance and make decisions about the effectiveness of the 2 things. So this teacher, the criterion process is, she says, I want to compare 2 ways. One is a multisensory activity, and the other is a flashcard. Okay. And then rating scales. Rating scales are a series of statements or questions that require some judgment about the degree or frequency of the behavior or characteristics described in each statement. Sample formats is a numerical scale. In all this, you folks, don't write a ton. Just paraphrase it very briefly so you have that in your notes, so you know what that is. Then this graphic scale is explained here. Formal rating scales may be useful in assessing students with social emotional behavior problems, but that's not really what we're talking about here. We're really focusing in on academic things here, because there are some commercial formal rating scales like determining ADHD, ADD, those types of things. Here's another thing for determining how to teach. You may do interviews. Parents, teachers, students can be used to determine how to teach. Teacher obtain information about specific techniques or use with the student can be obtained or students' interests, favorite activities, problem areas, attitudes, as well as how the student is perceived at home. Interview those. Then charting. Teacher can manipulate an antecedent event. What is antecedent? That's the A. Something happens before, such as seating arrangement. That's what you'd or consequence event, like awards pointed for work, and analyze the charting to see whether performance improves or declines, remains the same. And go back to the graphing, and you look at those interventions. You make notes about your interventions. That today he sat here, and today he got this kind of reward. And you don't change those too fast. You leave them in place a period of time so you can really analyze them. What about alternative assessments? This is a long thing. Like one is portfolios is common. You know about portfolios. You've created these. The collection must include student participation in selecting contents, the criteria for the selection, and the criteria for judging merit, and evidence all student reflections. So that's one of the things that discuss in here is the portfolios as an alternative assessment. My son's in middle school, and they're doing some of this where the student has to pull out what they deem to be some of their best work and then analyze it and being able to explain why they think that. That's still portfolio stuff over there. So then we come up here on this factors in assessing how to teach. So there's different factors that we're going to study. And let me give you a flyover here. You're going to pull one line out of each of these, the effects they have on determining how to teach. And then we're going to talk about, this is still how to teach. We're going to talk a little bit about these different factors. First of all, those expectation factors. Refers to an individual's orientational learning. Learners, teachers, peers, and parental expectations. Folks, I'm going to bring that back here also and ask you to bring one line about each of these. And I highlighted them here. This is on page 103. So turn to page 103, 104, and talk about these factors: the learner, the teacher, and the peer and the parents, their expectations for each of those. Tell what effect that'll have on how to teach for each of these. I'll put that on here. You may want to stop now and do that, but write a thing about how each of these affects how to teach. Then here's the stimulus events, this antecedent we talked about. Include an array of materials, instructional methods, classroom settings, like physical settings, instructional management, those things. And then these response factors also usually require students to make a motor or verbal thing, like selecting the type of response. Is it okay? This is one of the more simple things you can do to help work with students is, how do I respond? Do I have to write everything? You want to see kids grow that are struggling learners? Make them write everything. Can I point? Can I make gestures? Can I say it out loud? It can be crucial to that activity is how they respond. And this also can be a factor. Is give me some time. Remember, I can't keep up. I can't process. I can't process things as fast. I need more response time, and you can influence that greatly, whether the regular ed teacher or the special education teacher. So let's just go back to the textbook here a little bit on these different things. Here's your parental expectations and the influence they can have. Then here's these stimulus events, these antecedents. First of all is the physical settings, and then instructional arrangements and techniques and materials and how effect that'll have on students. And this is a rating scale, and this gives you a lot of great ideas. For example, you would ask the student to rate these, or you would do this depending on what the student's ability level. But you would say, rate each of these. It always happens frequently. Like for example, noise. Students like to work in a quiet area. And here, this is an entire page of things that you would consider for the antecedents. Student needs simple instructions. The student really models the behaviors of peers. The student models the behavior of the teacher. Rate each of these, but the biggest thing I like about this thing is it gives you some ideas of things that could be involved. Look at here, temperature of the room, the lighting, the general physical factors, instructional arrangements of things. So those are some factors that could affect the stimulus, the antecedent. And this comes into those response factors. A motor or verbal response or both, like such as pointing, making gestures. Do I have to write? Can I connect dots? Can I push buttons? Can I operate the recorder? Can I color items? Can I arrange items on a felt board or stuff like that? Or can I just say yes or no on things? So see if you can figure out that response time. Many students with learning problems need assistant organizing response. They need that time. Student likes simple one-word responses, likes brief discussions. That's where you got to get to know the student, and you can have input from others. All can kind of become a factor. Here's a whole list, and these are really, I think, pretty cool also, of some things that you can consider on response. And you can try different things in your instructional model. And then the subsequent events is what happens afterwards. Social praise, special activities and privileges, evaluation marks, positive physical expressions, awards, tokens, tangible things. All that simply can ask the student or note free time preferences. How do you determine what motivates? That's what this is about. Again, I'd like to give you a bunch of ideas. You look at this here that I have highlighted on page 108. What are some ideas on those subsequent events? Analysis of that learning profile, factors, predictive. Let me go back here once. This was about the response factors, and how they affect it. Say this should give you some ideas of how to impact working with students. This is interesting on grading. Results of a national survey of classroom grading practices of general education teachers indicate that teachers find certain grading adaptations such as pass-fail grades, portfolios, multiple grades, and grading for effort to be helpful for students with and without disabilities. And you know about this. This was part of your world. The following types of grading alternatives may have been used to accommodate the special needs of students in inclusion. Okay, again, you look at this and some of the data is old, but it kind of stood the test of time. And well, again, I want you to write one line about each of these, what it is, and an example of using it. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Stop this now and go to your textbook and respond to these 10 things, writing one line about each of those. And an example in your notes. Okay. I'm going to come back here now to the text perspective on how to teach. The functional assessment of academic behavior provides educators with an assessment device for evaluating and obtaining information about the individual's student's instructional environment. And that's what you do. A functional assessment is about their environment. And then they talk a lot about how to determine that. Read this to you. An educational diagnostician, was asked to test a 13-year-old student, Stephanie, who was being seen in a hospital-based pediatric clinic. When he arrived to test her, he discovered that her folder had been misplaced, so he proceeded to test her without the benefit of background information. In the beginning of the testing session, Stephanie worked intensely. However, as testing continued, she lowered her head and mumbled incorrect answers. When the examiner asked whether she was okay, she did not respond. Though continued efforts to talk with Stephanie, he realized that she stopped trying when the test items became difficult. He explained the test covered material through the 5th grade and that she was expected to miss some items. Or I should say through the 12th grade, and she was expected to miss some items. He asked her to try. I'm turning the page. This is student learning profile and treatment plan. Like teacher thinks teacher dislikes him. Learner expectations. That's so interesting. I talk about this in classroom management if they think the teacher doesn't like them. This is Stephanie again. Do her best. He mentioned that they would take a refreshment break periodically throughout the testing. Stephanie liked the idea of taking breaks and promised to do her best. When Stephanie's test responses were scored, she achieved average or above average scores in reading, math, and spelling. Several days later, the examiner was asked to present the results. Staffing, much to the examiner's dismay, the pediatrician, the psychologist, and the language clinician reported that Stephanie performed at a very low level. In fact, they agreed that she was trainably mentally retarded. Whoops. The full-scale IQ of 37. Whoops. Furthermore, they noted that she had been in special classes for mental disabilities for about 8 years. When the educational diagnostician presented Stephanie's scores, he reported average or above average scores for a 13-year-old. Whoops. That's kind of scary, isn't it? That you'd miss it that far. The team was puzzled in the results, but discussion revealed that Stephanie had lowered her head and mumbled incorrect responses throughout the testing with all the team members except the educator. It was agreed that the student scores in the educational testing were most valid, and the teams recommended that she be placed in the general class. So again, what that's about is how those subsequent things can play a role. And this is the thing about rating. Grades serve several important functions, including providing feedback to students regarding their learning. And this is all about the grading, what we just looked at, and I'm asking you to play a role in that, and the types of alternative grading. Bring those in there. And again, I was just whining a second ago about I'm not a big fan of the grading process. I would much rather see the data, the graphing. And this is about how to develop effective grading. Determine grades on the basis of mastery of course objectives. When students can pass a course on the basis of mastered course objectives, they realize that they can succeed regardless of performance of other students. And how do you do that? Well, information that all students should learn, information that most students should learn, and that some students should learn. So this is a little bit of that tier process also on how we teach them. These are the guidelines. You have to do that. And so this tier thing is you determine what should all know, and then what should most know, and then what should some know. And you have to look at, first of all, course objectives first, of what can the lower functioning students do without, and then only test and teach over those. Multiple evaluation methods. Students understand the grading systems. Monitor the performance of students frequently and give feedback. I tell my people, catch them early. If you've got a student not responding and not turning in seat work, don't wait till they're behind 3 or 4 things. Monitor that closer than that. Remember, the effective grading system is a motivational tool for most, not all. See if they have to take the district-wide test based on their abilities, and what are those alternative grading things that they could use. And this is about testing modifications. And I brought one of those out for you. Success on most teacher-made tests requires that the students have well-developed attention and memory skills. Okay, so you can't always change that. Listen to this again. Success on most teacher-made tests requires that the students have well-developed attention and memory skills. And one of the things you battle with kids with learning disabilities is you can do all this you want, but sometimes there's only so much fits in that bucket. And that's why we go to that tier system where what does all the students need to know, then what do some students need to know, or most know, and then what do some need to know, and that's the higher level ones. Because a lot of our kids with lower IQs can't memorize that much stuff, can't remember it. Thus, teacher-made tests may be an obstacle for students whose ability to take these tests is limited because of disability. So, we have 25 test modifications we'll look at in a second, but here's some other ones. You ever thought of this one? A little advance. Allow use of technological equipment. You can read these too. I'm on page 113. Different test modifications. From the inspection of the results, found that these students, I think I brought this here. Teacher-made tests. Yeah, now I'm going to give you this. I'm going to put this up for you to have because I want you to put this on your wiki. But what's interesting about this particular one is these are ranked by teachers. Like 96.9% interviewed said they provide ample space for students to respond to items in the protocol. And all these are above 50%. This top 25 list, 50% of teachers had to list it as one. Okay, so that's why that's on here. I want to get this off for you. All right. So you look through this at some things to modify tests. And you take this onto your wiki. Now, having said that, then this researcher here, Gajera, they're most likely to make testing modifications they perceive maintain academic integrity. This is their thing with it. They perceive maintain academic integrity, are effective and require minimum individual terms and extra time demands and resources. So what he found was these 25 things listed, teachers felt it still maintain academic integrity, which to us as teachers, as it will be for you, is important. They're effective in helping the student do better and require minimum utilization of terms of planning, time, and resources. There it is. I tore it out of here. And what they found was this really broke down into 4 areas of modification. You can modify number 1, the presentation format. Number 2, you can modify the setting. Number 3, you can modify the response format, and we talked about responses before. Or number 5, you can modify, or number 4, you can modify the timing of it. So modifications can be broken into one of those 4 areas, or more than one. And then this last part goes into record keeping. Let me take you back to the notes here. Here's those formats that we talked about. One of 4 things. Even this, taking a test carrel or in a group or at home or in a special ed class. So when you go to present a test, which of these 4 areas, and you know that the ones we looked at all guarded the integrity and those types of things. So this is about record keeping. Students enjoy that, and they're participating in record keeping. Teachers gain satisfaction from having documented student progress. Teachers can target learning difficulties and make timely interventions. Teachers can share the progress of students with parents, principals, and this is me, grumpy me, that don't give me grades, give me data. And data can be used to help make program and placement decisions. Remember what placement is? is where we're going to serve them. And this is you, that you're able to quantify. You're able to quantify this, assign numbers to it, to make it effective. I'll take you out here in the textbook a little farther. Kicks in from composite to daily record keeping here. But one of the things you do on composite is the instructional objectives. For example, in science, I want to explain this a little bit. For example, in science, let's say that we're working with a regular teacher and we're doing science, and we go into a new unit, and on this unit we determine that there's 10 things that the students are going to have to learn in this unit. But one of the things that we may have to do with our kids is prioritize those 10 into the 4 or 5 things that you want them to be responsible for. It takes us back to this. 10 is what a few will be able to do. 7 is what most should be able to do. But here's 4 that all students should be able to master. The higher functioning kids will do 10, most will do 7, but they all should be able to get 4 of these objectives. And then, as a special ed teacher, you pay most attention to those 4 in teaching and projects and testing over those 4 objectives. Okay. So this was assessing to teach. How to do assessment, what and how to teach. And now you've got some other things to do here.